thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this group. I really appreciate it. It's a sterling group. I'm going to talk briefly about some things that I've been interested in the last 8 or 10 years. I became interested in 3 sets of ideas sort of simultaneously. One of them is the personality dimension of impulse versus constraint. Another one is serotonergic function. And the third is dual process model. I'm going to focus mostly on the impulse versus constraint part of this in this talk. Serotonergic function, and I should say even before I start that this is clearly a cartoon image of serotonergic function. This is one of the things that serotonergic function may be about. It's about a lot of different things. It is widely held that serotonergic function underlies anxiety-related traits. And there is some research that makes that case and makes it reasonably well. Research linking it to neuroticism and to vigilance. But there's other research that doesn't seem to fit that picture nearly so well, including things that related to sensation seeking and so on. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I were blundering around and we were asking what would be an alternative way of thinking about this. One piece of evidence, one part of the evidence that seems to provide a really useful cue is a set of laboratory studies that other people have done, which show that low serotonergic function increases impulsiveness and aggression in the lab, but that these effects are clearest among people who are pre-assessed as being relatively aggressive people. And in fact, there are now at least 2 studies in the literature that show that the effect reverses among people who are pre-assessed as being low in aggressiveness. So this is not really about aggression. This is really about releasing whatever the strong reactive tendency is that the person has. We did a review of evidence and concluded from it that a lot of the evidence is consistent with the idea, which turns out not to be an entirely new idea, that serotonin is involved in impulse control, particularly impulsive reactions to intense emotion. So with that conceptual background in mind, we collected a set of data on a big undergraduate sample with self-report measures, and a subsample was interviewed for a lifetime episode of major depressive disorder. We collected blood for genotyping, and we did a bunch of analyses on what came from it. We had a lot of measures bearing on impulsiveness versus constraint. Some of these measures were pre-existing. Some of them were things that we created ourselves for this project. We tried to get, as much as we could, items bearing on the parts of impulsiveness that we thought might be most important. So the urgency measure from the UPPS, about half the items refer to negativity, and about half are pretty neutral. This is a neutral kind of item. Hard for me to resist acting on my feelings. We got some items about, we created some items about feelings influencing one's view of the world right at the moment. We wrote some items about reacting reflexively to feelings, and all of these items are neutral. The positive urgency measure is reacting to feelings, reacting to positive feelings, specific to positive feelings. Because we wanted to have diversity among our measures, we included lack of perseverance from the UPPS. We wrote some items about having trouble overcoming lethargy, being paralyzed by sadness. My colleagues were particularly interested in depression and mood disorders, so we had a variety of scales that might bear on the impulse-related properties of depression, and some other kinds of things dealing with behavioral aspects of impulsivity. With all those scales, we smushed them down into 3 components, and we called the first one pervasive influence of feelings, loading these scales, for the most part, mostly negative feelings, not wholly, but mostly. Second factor we call lack of follow-through. Nothing in here about feelings. Just I get distracted by stray things. I don't follow through. I'm lazy. Don't have a lot of self-control. And then the third factor that squeezed out was we call feelings trigger action. This loaded principally on reflexive reaction feelings, our item set, on positive urgency, and the secondary loading on negative urgency. Now, I've highlighted the word feelings here because these two factors are about feelings. The middle one is not. But this issue turns out to be important as we continue. In the genotyping, we genotyped the serotonin transporter polymorphism, and we found an interaction with early life adversity to predict two factors: pervasive influence of feelings, feelings trigger action. Both of the feeling factors. Nothing for lack of follow-through. The effect that is probably more interesting is this second one. And I'll just show you the graph of that one, feelings trigger action. It's a nice spreading interaction that looks just like one like Okay. Now let me back up a bit and point out that another reason that my colleagues and I were interested in serotonergic function is that serotonin has been linked to a variety of kinds of problem behaviors. There is substantial literature linking low serotonergic function to impulsivity. Impulsivity is linked to problem behaviors. But let's ask the question how wide that linkage is. We chose depression as being the least likely case that impulsivity would relate to depression. So that's the one that we looked at first. And what we did was we went back to that same data set. We predicted each of the impulsiveness factors by major depression status from the interview. We incorporated the audit as a measure of externalizing problems as a control, just in case anything we found was really attributable to secondary external sorts of problems. We had oversampled a bit for people that we thought might be vulnerable to depression based on the pretest scale. So we were able to get 34 positive cases from these interviews. And these then are the factor scores from that factor analysis of the self-reported items. Pervasive influence of feelings, lack of follow-through, feelings trigger action, and the two factors having to do with feelings both distinguish between those who had skidded positively for an episode of major depression and those who had not. And that's already controlling for audit scores. Happened also to have concurrent VBI scores on people. Further control for VBI scores didn't remove these effects. They're right there. Now, the first finding, the first factor, not much of a surprise. Because if you think back to what scales loaded on that factor, these are the things that we included mostly because they had some sort of connection to depression. They had some hints of negativity in the items. They were about when something bad happens, my worldview of the moment becomes colored quickly by that. Not terribly surprising. But the third factor, which shows up here, is a little bit more surprising unless you were entering the analysis from the perspective that we entered it from. The idea that we're looking here at reactivity to emotions. Remember that that third factor is made up mostly of our items designed to assess reflexive reaction feelings. neutral as to feeling content, nothing there about valence, and a positive urgency measure, where all the items reference positive feelings. So we went back and we took the positive urgency scale by itself and compared the groups on that one, and yet, lo and behold, positive urgency scores distinguished between the two groups. People who had skidded positively for major depressive disorder reported higher positive urgency than the controls did. We were very proud of ourselves for having found this counterintuitive thing. And then it turned out that, as happens more often than one might like, it turns out that by now there are probably more than these three, but there are several studies in the literature showing that people who are diagnosed with depression have higher impulsivity than people who are not, who have never been diagnosed with depression. All of these studies made use of the Barrett scale, which distinguishes among manifestations, but doesn't distinguish much about precursors of impulsivity. So in some sense, it's a little less important. Another study that's not part of our work, done after this, has even found that positive urgency among adolescents prospectively was a predictor of development of depression. So I'm fairly confident that positive urgency is a reflection of something basic underlying that's important. In that first sample of ours, we also had a bunch of other measures that reflect problems. They're not really, they're not diagnostic levels of problems, but they at least reflect kinds of problems. And these are just regressions predicting these various scales from the three impulsivity factors, and I've highlighted the one that is of most interest. The anger questionnaire, 4 scales for anger, physical aggression, verbal aggression. The audit, borderline screener, the mask, somatic anxiety. All these measures are associated with that third factor, feelings trigger action. We had a measure of manic temperament, hypomanic personality scale, again related to feelings trigger action. That is maybe not so surprising. My colleague Sherry Johnson has data on a sample of bipolar 1 versus controls, and these are different set of measures, but same basic sorts of findings. In this sample, all of these different measures distinguished people diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder from controls. So we're starting to think about impulsive responding to emotions versus being able to control those emotions as being a functional dimension. Well, it is a functional dimension, and in some respects, that's my main point here, is that it does not dictate a phenotype. It does not tell you what kind of behavior to expect to see. It yields many different kinds of behavioral phenotypes, depending on what else is going on in the person. Our findings in this respect are consistent with the press towards developing dimensional models of vulnerabilities that cross-cut disorders, promotes thinking also in terms of interactions. And what I've focused on here today is, by implication, an interaction between responsiveness to emotion, which has been my main focus, and sensitivity of approach tendencies. If you have weak approach tendencies, you are vulnerable to depression, more so to the extent that you also are lacking this ability to control your responses to emotion. Because your responses to depressed emotion is more intense, more behaviorally intense. If you have a strong approach system, very reactive approach system, manic tendencies, sensation seeking, impulsive aggression are all more likely and exaggerated by responsivity to emotion. I haven't talked about this, I really have not looked at this very much, but similarly there ought to be an interaction between responsiveness to emotion and sensitivity of the avoidance system. So with strong threat sensitivity, you have some vulnerability to anxiety disorders being jacked up by responsiveness to emotion. With weak threat sensitivity, perhaps tendencies towards psychopathic properties. All of these cases, what I think we're seeing is a difficulty in overriding emotions seems to take small problems and pump them up into larger ones, and let them pump themselves up into larger ones. I have focused on serotonergic function here because I've focused on this tendency to be able to restrain, and clearly I want to acknowledge that impulsivity is not purely about serotonergic function. We'll hear more later on in this meeting about dopamine. We have also done some analyses with dopamine-related genes in that same sample. This is the part I've already talked about, the transporter gene relating to two of those factors in impulsivity. But we find DRD4 is related to two of them, BDNF is related to two of them, AK1 is related to one of them, and COMT is related to one of them. Interestingly, the contributions of these various genes to predicting the factors were pretty much independent of each other. The one that I focused on most here, let me just show that one. There were two separate predictors, independent of each other. They're both individual significant contributors with a final R-squared that's at least a little respectable. So I think I'm out of time and I'm out of slides. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to address, or at least dance around any questions.